Listen closely because what you are about to hear is not casual crypto chatter. This is a controlled leak of perspective that flips the entire XRP narrative on its head, and if you blink, you will miss why today's price action is triggering quiet reactions behind closed doors at institutions that never speak publicly. Because while the crowd is distracted by noise and red candles, something far more structural is unfolding right now, something tied to Ripple's positioning, the SEC's silence, BlackRock's sudden comfort with tokenization narratives, and the IMF's long-running obsession with cross-border liquidity efficiency. And here's the setup you must understand immediately. XRP's recent price behavior is not random, it is not retail-driven panic, and it is absolutely not weakness. It is compression, it is absorption, it is a market deliberately being kept in a narrow psychological cage while leverage resets and weak hands are cycled out. And ask yourself this extreme question right now. If XRP were truly finished, why is it still one of the most surveilled assets by regulators? Why does every major liquidity discussion quietly reference RippleNet standards? And why does the SEC still refuse to give XRP the clean headline everyone expects? Because silence at this level is not indecision, it is strategy. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the mainstream narrative. The same institutions that publicly downplay XRP are privately stress-testing settlement layers, liquidity corridors, and tokenized asset rails, where XRP already exists as a neutral bridge. And that is why today's price action matters more than the price itself, because price is the bait, structure is the signal, and before we go any further, do not let this information die with you. If you value being early instead of emotional, hit subscribe, stay with this channel, and lock in. Because what we are breaking down here is not for casual viewers. This is for people who understand that markets move on positioning long before headlines catch up. And as we move deeper, you're going to see why this exact moment is being ignored on purpose, why fear is being amplified while data is being buried, and why this so-called boring XRP range could be the calm before something that makes people say WTF just happened. Now stay with me because this is where the data starts whispering what the headlines refuse to say out loud. And it begins with authority signals, not hype charts. Because while retail stares at candles, institutions watch liquidity behavior, regulatory posture, and network relevance. And XRP is lighting up all three in a way that should make you pause, because on-chain activity remains stubbornly alive even during muted price movement. Escrow releases continue like clockwork with zero disruption. And Ripple's partnerships keep expanding in regions the Western media barely covers, like the Middle East, Asia Pacific, and IMF-aligned corridors. And let's talk about authority for a second, because when the SEC drags its feet, it is not always because they are unsure. Sometimes it is because a premature conclusion breaks too many downstream negotiations. And that matters because XRP is no longer just a token in a lawsuit. It is a liquidity instrument sitting in the middle of conversations about tokenized treasuries, cross-border settlement, and real-time gross settlement alternatives. And yes, BlackRock doesn't need to hold XRP to validate the rails. They only need to acknowledge tokenization as inevitable, which Larry Fink has already done publicly. And once you connect that to the BIS, the IMF, and their long-standing reports on frictionless settlement layers, you start to see why Ripple keeps getting invited into rooms Bitcoin maxis are never allowed into. And here's the extreme question you should be asking right now. If XRP were irrelevant, why does every serious regulatory body treat it like a live wire instead of a dead coin? Why do they speak cautiously instead of dismissively? And why do legacy banks test everything except the asset retail is emotionally trading? Because this price action is not about today. It's about clearing the runway, about letting uncertainty exhaust itself, and about ensuring that when clarity arrives, positioning is already locked. And that is why the data matters more than the drama, because authority always moves quietly, and when it finally speaks, it never asks permission from the crowd. Here's where things get explosive, because now we step into the catalyst zone, the exact triggers that retail misses while institutions quietly accumulate. And the first thing you need to understand is this. Every dip, Every sideways grind, every boring consolidation candle you see right now is being manipulated, not maliciously, but strategically, to absorb uncertainty and flush out weak hands, because XRP's structural setup is primed for a shock event that mainstream media refuses to predict. And WTF, yes, shock. Because when rumors of regulatory clarity hit, when BlackRock-backed infrastructure quietly signals readiness, and when cross-border corridors suddenly see live liquidity testing, XRP doesn't just move, it detonates. And ask yourself this: if Ripple were weak, why are global liquidity tests still referencing XRP rails? Why are banks and payment providers continuing pilot programs? And why is the SEC still silent instead of announcing a definitive ban or clearance? Because silence here is deafening, and it's signaling more than you think. It's signaling controlled chaos. And you must read it correctly to survive the next move. Because this is exactly the moment FUD is being weaponized to scare retail while the smart money quietly builds. And don't be fooled by bearish news cycles, by Twitter panic, or by headline inflation, because every narrative saying XRP is over is the exact opposite of reality. Every supposedly negative article is a setup for the squeeze that only those watching authority signals understand. And here's where it becomes conspiratorial: the SEC's delays, the IMF's publications, the BIS reports, even the occasional ripple in the Treasury discussions are all interconnected threads, subtle yet explosive when tied together, and the foodie you see in forums, in YouTube comment sections, and in mainstream coverage, that is a distraction. A smokescreen designed to hide the real mechanics, the positioning, and the accumulation patterns that are invisible to casual eyes. And that, my friends, is why knowing the catalyst is not just useful, it is mandatory if you want to avoid being trapped on the wrong side of what could be one of the most consequential liquidity events in crypto history. Now we arrive at the point where everything clicks, where the price justification emerges and the warnings can no longer be ignored, because XRP's current setup is screaming one thing: the market is building tension, and when it releases, it will make every retail panic and every mainstream misread look like child's play. And listen carefully, because the price you see today is not a reflection of value. It is a psychological weapon, a compression zone designed to align retail, institutional, and regulatory timeline so that when the next move hits, it hits with maximum leverage, maximum liquidity, and maximum shock. And here's the extreme calculation for you. Consider the volume accumulation in Asia-Pacific corridors, the incremental but steady integration in European banks, RippleNet's expansion in the Middle East, and combine that with the SEC's prolonged silence, BlackRock's public tokenization signals, and IMF commentary on cross-border frictionless settlement, and you begin to see a scenario where the market is primed for a sudden, decisive move that could dwarf any retail expectation. And ask yourself this: if you ignore this now, if you dismiss it as noise, when the rally comes, will you be ready or left scrambling while the smart money executes perfectly? Because this is not hypothetical, this is structural, and the numbers behind the scenes justify a narrative that mainstream charts cannot touch. They cannot quantify institutional positioning, regulatory readiness, or corridor expansion, yet that is exactly what dictates real price action. And here's the final warning you cannot ignore: do not chase, do not panic, and do not trust casual reporting, because XRP is quietly operating in rooms you are never invited to. And when clarity drops, the gap between those who prepared and those who panicked will be historic. It will be brutal, and it will change everything you thought you knew about crypto price mechanics. So mark this moment, study it, understand it, because the next move will not wait for the crowd. It will execute with precision. And if you are paying attention right now, you are already ahead of 90% of the market, but fail to act wisely. And even this privileged insight will be meaningless in the face of unstoppable structural momentum. Here's the conclusion you need to lock into your mind, because this is where the dots connect and the urgency crystallizes. XRP right now is not just a crypto asset, It is a structural signal, a real-time indicator of how institutions, regulators, and liquidity corridors are quietly aligning behind frameworks mainstream media pretends don't exist. And if you have been following closely, you already know that the current price action is the calm before the storm, the absorption before the breakout, and the manipulation before the revelation. And ask yourself this final question. When the mainstream finally acknowledges what you already know, will you be positioned or will you be caught in reactive panic like everyone else? Because timing is everything and insight without execution is wasted potential. So take this moment seriously. Study the patterns, watch the corridors, understand the regulatory nuances, and prepare because XRP is about to remind the world why it is not just a token. It is a bridge, a tool, and a quietly dominant force in the evolving global financial system. And remember, the difference between observers and winners is not luck. It is preparation, knowledge, and the courage to act when the herd is blinded by FUD. So if you've absorbed this, internalized it, and are ready to move with discipline, you are already ahead. Because while others argue over price, the real game has already been won in the rooms, reports, and private corridors that dictate how crypto moves when nobody is watching.